The rock was the last cruelty. It was a sharp, flinty thing hidden in the dirt of the road, and when Mai's worn-out boot slipped, her hand, already raw from the weight of the burlap sack, slammed down upon it. Pain, white and blinding, shot up her arm. She didn't cry out. The sound was a luxury she had packed away with every other soft thing from her old life. Instead, she simply stopped, her shoulders slumping under the heavy roll of bedding strapped to her back, the two sacks in her hand seeming to root her to the scorched earth of the Nevada territory. Dust, fine as flour, coated her tattered gray dress and clung to the sweat on her face. It was the summer of 1878, and the sun was a merciless hammer in a brassy sky. For 3 days she had walked, ever since her stepmother had stood on the porch of the only home I had ever known, pointed a bony finger down the road, and said words that had ended her childhood. Her father had been gone 6 months, and with him, any protection she might have had. Now, at 18, she was nothing more than a stray dog to be shooed away. She straightened her back, the muscles screaming in protest, and shifted the grip on her sacks. One held her father's heavy ledger books, which she could not bear to leave behind, and the other her few items of clothing and a small tin of tea. They were everything she had in the world. But as she took a half-step forward, a shadow fell over her. It was vast and sudden, eclipsing the punishing sun. Mai froze, her heart seizing in her chest. She had been careful, keeping to the open road where she could see trouble coming, but she hadn't heard a thing. Slowly, she lifted her head. The man sat atop a horse so black it seemed to drink the light from the air. He was a silhouette against the glare, broad-shouldered and still, his hat pulled low. He was just watching her. Fear, cold and familiar, washed through her. She had heard the stories from the other Chinese women who worked in the laundries and kitchens back in town. Stories of what happened to girls who were alone, who were seen as less than human. Without a second thought, she turned to run, to scramble away into the sagebrush, sacks and all. It was a fool's hope. Her legs were heavy as stone, her body spent. She managed 2 clumsy, stumbling steps before his voice stopped her. It was not the voice she expected. It was low and quiet, with a rough edge to it, like worn leather. Whoa now. Hold on. She stopped, but she did not turn. Her body was a knot of tension, every muscle coiled to flee. I'm not going to hurt you, he said. The horse shifted, its tack creaking in the immense silence of the landscape. You look like you're about to fall over. Mai risked a glance over her shoulder. He hadn't moved closer. He had a plain, weathered face, the kind carved by sun and wind. His eyes were shadowed by the brim of his hat, but she could feel their steady gaze. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't sneering either. He just looked tired. I have water, he offered, gesturing to a canteen strapped to his saddle. Her tongue felt like a piece of dry wood in her mouth. She hadn't had a proper drink since morning, from a tepid, muddy creek that had made her stomach cramp. The offer was a lifeline, but it could also be a trap. She shook her head, a small, jerky motion. The man sighed, a soft exhalation of air. He swung a long leg over his horse and dismounted with an easy, practiced grace. He was tall, taller than her father had been. He moved with a deliberate slowness, as if he understood he was dealing with a spooked animal. He unhooked the canteen and took a drink himself, then held it out. It's just water, he said. Sun's no joke out here. You'll be on the ground in another mile. Her pride warred with a desperate, animal thirst. She could feel the blood pounding in her temples. Finally, her body made the decision for her. She let the sacks drop to the ground with a soft thud and took a hesitant step toward him. Her hands were shaking as she reached for the canteen. He let her take it without their fingers touching. The metal was cool against her skin. She drank greedily, the water tasting of tin and life itself. When she was done, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and held it out for him to take back. He didn't. He was looking at her hands, at the raw, scraped knuckles and the angry red wheal on her palm where she had fallen on the rock. Where are you headed? He asked, his voice still quiet. Away, she mumbled, her gaze fixed on the dust at her feet. Away is a mighty big place, he observed. He nudged one of the sacks with the toe of his boot. And these look heavy. She said nothing, just bent to retrieve her belongings. The thought of lifting them again made her want to weep. He saw the hesitation, the slight tremble in her arms. I've got a wagon just over that rise, he said. I'm heading back to my ranch. It's another 5 miles. You can ride in the back. When she stiffened, he added quickly, I need some help around the place. Mending, cooking. Nothing untoward. I'll pay you a fair wage. Room and board. It was an offer of salvation. But it was also the oldest story in the world. A man, a lone girl, a remote ranch. No one would ever know what happened to her. No one would even look. Her stepmother had called her worthless, a foreign burden. Maybe this was what worthless girls deserved. Yet, as she looked up at him, she saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his hands, though calloused and strong, were gentle as he restrapped the canteen to his saddle. He wasn't looking at her like she was a prize, he was looking at her like she was a person in trouble. He seemed to understand her silence. My name is Silas Blackwood, he said, as if offering a piece of himself for inspection. My place is small, but it's honest. My look back down the road she had come, a ribbon of dust and heat shimmering into nothing. Then she looked at the road ahead, which was exactly the same. There was no safety in either direction. There was only this man, this horse, and this one single offer. Taking it was a risk. Not taking it was a certainty of slow death under the sun. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Relief flickered across his face, so quick she almost missed it. All right then, he said. Let's get your things. He lifted her sacks as if they were filled with feathers, placing them in the back of a sturdy buckboard wagon that had been hidden from view by a small rise. He helped her onto the seat, his hand briefly touching her elbow. His touch was firm and impersonal, and he let go the second she was steady. As he climbed up beside her and clicked the reins, the wagon lurched forward. Mai sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap, watching the vast, empty landscape roll by. She had traded the certainty of the road for the complete unknown, and she had no idea if she had just made the best decision of her life, or the very last one. The Blackwood Ranch was not a ranch so much as a declaration of stubbornness against an unforgiving land. A small, clapboard house, weathered to the color of bone, stood beside a solid-looking barn. A few corrals held a handful of cattle and several horses. The place was neat, everything in its proper place, but it was stark. There were no flowers, no curtains in the windows, no sign of a woman's touch. The silence here was different from the silence of the road. It was heavier, settled deep into the bones of the place. Silas showed her to a small room at the back of the house. It contained a narrow cot, a small table, and a single window that looked out onto an endless expanse of dry grass and distant, hazy mountains. It's not much, he said, placing her sacks on the floor. But it's clean. The well is out back. Kitchen's through there. I'm usually out until sundown. And with that, he left her alone. Mai stood in the middle of the room for a long time, listening to the sound of his boots fading away. She unpacked her few belongings, placing the tin of tea on the table like a small anchor in this strange new sea. In the bottom of one sack, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was her father's kitchen knife. It was heavy and sharp. She slid it under the thin mattress of her cot. The days that followed fell into a quiet, monotonous rhythm. Mai rose before dawn, lighting the stove and putting on coffee. She cooked for Silas simple meals of beans, bacon, and skillet bread. She cleaned the small house, which was tidy but thick with a layer of dust that spoke of long neglect. She mended his work shirts, her stitches small and neat. Silas, for his part, rarely spoke. He ate what she put in front of him, sometimes offering a quiet, much obliged, and then he would be gone, out on the range until the sky was bruised with twilight. He never entered her room. He never stood too close. But she felt his eyes on her sometimes, a watchful, assessing gaze that she couldn't quite decipher. She remained wary, a tightly wound spring, sleeping with the knife within easy reach. The loneliness of the ranch was profound, but it was a different kind of loneliness than the terror of the road. Here, at least, there was a roof and there was water. About 2 weeks after she arrived, the supplies began to run low. "We'll need to go into Clayton tomorrow," Silas announced one evening, his voice startling her in the quiet kitchen. A knot of dread formed in her stomach. Clayton. A town. People. Whispers and stares. Here on the ranch, she was invisible. In town, she would be a spectacle, a white man with a young Chinese girl. It was a dangerous picture to paint. "I can stay here," she offered quickly. "You can write a list." Silas shook his head. "You need a proper dress, some better shoes. Those things you're wearing are falling apart," he said it not as a criticism, but as a simple fact. "I owe you 2 weeks' wages. You should pick out what you need yourself." There was no arguing with his logic. The next morning, they rode into town on the buckboard. The moment they left the isolation of the ranch and hit the main road, Mai felt a change in the air. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to make herself smaller. Clayton was a dusty collection of wooden buildings lining a single wide street. As they pulled up in front of the general store, the few people milling about stopped to stare. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity and open disapproval. Mai kept her eyes down, focusing on the splintered boardwalk as she followed Silas inside. The store was dim and smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dust. A pot-bellied man behind the counter, the storekeeper, nodded at Silas. "Blackwood," he grunted. His eyes slid over to Mai, lingering for a moment too long. They gathered their supplies in silence: flour, salt, coffee, cartridges for Silas's rifle. Silas then led her to a corner where bolts of fabric were stacked. "Go on," he said softly. "Pick something." As Mai hesitantly reached for a bolt of simple blue calico, a shadow fell over them. A large man with a florid face and a prosperous belly blocked the aisle. He wore a tailored suit, out of place in the dusty store, and a silver watch chain was draped across his vest. "Well now, Blackwood," the man said, his voice oozing a false heartiness. "Didn't figure you for the sociable type." His eyes swept over Mai with an ownership that made her skin crawl. "Found yourself some new help?" Silas stiffened. He didn't turn around fully, but his shoulders broadened, creating a subtle barrier between the man and Mai. "My business is my own, Thorne," he said, his voice flat and cold. The man, Thorne, chuckled. Of course. Just making conversation. A man gets lonely out on that spread of yours." Understandable. He took a step closer, deliberately invading Mai's space. "Can she even speak English?" Before Mai could react, before she could even breathe, Silas moved. It was not a fast or aggressive motion. He simply turned his body fully, placing himself directly in Jedediah Thorne's path. He was not as large as Thorne, but he seemed to take up all the air in the narrow aisle. "Mr. Thorne," Silas said, and his voice was so low it was almost a whisper, but it cut through the low murmur of the store like a razor. "This lady is under my protection. Step aside." The entire store went silent. The storekeeper froze with his hand on a pickle barrel. Thorne's jovial mask fell away, revealing a flash of raw anger in his eyes. He was a big man in this town, used to deference. To be challenged so quietly, so publicly, by a solitary rancher like Silas Blackwood was an insult he couldn't stomach. For a tense moment, the two men stood locked in a battle of wills. Thorne looked from Silas's unblinking gaze to Mai's frightened face and back again. Finally, with a small sneer, he backed away. "Have it your way, Blackwood," he muttered, turning on his heel and striding out of the store. The tension broke, but a new, heavier atmosphere settled in its place. The storekeeper wouldn't meet Silas's eyes. As they paid for their goods, Silas added the bolt of blue calico and a pair of sturdy work shoes to the pile, paying in coin without a word. The ride back to the ranch was silent, but the silence was different now. Mai kept stealing glances at the man beside her. He had defended her. Not with violence or shouting, but with a solid, unshakable presence. He had called her a lady. He had placed himself between her and danger. It was a gesture so unexpected, so contrary to everything she had been taught to expect, that it left her feeling dizzy and confused. She had been drawn into a conflict she didn't understand, a silent war between Silas Blackwood and Jedediah Thorne. But for the first time since her father died, she felt something other than fear. She felt seen. That night, a restless energy kept her awake. The moon was a silver sliver in a black sky. Drawn by a strange impulse, she went to her small window. And then she saw him. Silas was walking the perimeter of the house, a rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. He was not just a quiet rancher. He was a man on guard, a man who had been expecting trouble long before she arrived. And now, she was part of it. A week later, the sky turned a bruised purple and the wind began to howl, a mournful sound that seemed to creep through the very walls of the small house. A summer storm, vicious and sudden, descended on the ranch, trapping them inside. Rain lashed against the windows, and the world shrank to the four walls of the kitchen, lit by the warm glow of a kerosene lamp. The storm seemed to draw the tension in the house tighter. Silas sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with meticulous, focused movements. Mai was trying to patch a tear in a grain sack, but her hands were clumsy, her mind distracted by the roaring wind. It reminded her of the night her father had died, of the sound of her stepmother's wailing, a performance of grief that had chilled Mai to the bone. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the window pane, making her jump. The needle slipped, pricking her finger. A single drop of blood welled up, dark against her skin. She stared at it, and suddenly the carefully constructed walls she had built around her grief crumbled. A plate she was moving to the wash basin slipped from her numb fingers and shattered on the floorboards. The sound was like a gunshot in the small room. Mai froze, horrified. She expected anger, a sharp reprimand for her carelessness. Instead, Silas simply set down his rifle, his movement slow and deliberate. He looked at the broken pieces of ceramic, then at her. She was shaking, her whole body trembling with a grief so profound and so long suppressed it felt like a physical illness. He didn't speak. He just pulled out the chair opposite him and gestured for her to sit. Hesitantly, she did. He didn't try to comfort her, didn't offer empty platitudes. He just sat with her in the charged silence, the only sounds the drumming of the rain and the frantic beating of her own heart. After a long time, his voice, when it came, was rough with disuse. "I'm not a good man with words," he began, his gaze fixed on the lamp flame. Never have been. He paused, as if gathering his thoughts. "My wife, Sarah, she was the one with the words." Mai looked up, startled. He had never mentioned a wife. "Died 2 years back," he continued, his voice flat, devoid of self-pity. "Fever. Took her in 3 days. This place, it got real quiet after that." Too quiet. He finally looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw a loneliness that mirrored her own. "I saw you on that road. You had the same look in your eyes she did at the end. Like you were all alone in the world, and no one was coming. I couldn't just ride by." The simple, unadorned honesty of his words struck her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't pity that had made him stop. It wasn't charity or some darker motive. It was recognition. He had seen his own pain reflected in her. The knowledge loosened something tight and painful in her chest. Moved by an impulse she didn't fully understand, Mai rose and went to her room. From the bottom of her sack, she retrieved a small, intricately folded piece of rice paper. It was a letter from her father, written just before he died. It was in Chinese, a language she had been discouraged from using, and her reading was poor. But she knew the feel of the paper, the shape of his characters. It was the last piece of his love she had. She returned to the kitchen and sat down, holding the letter in her lap. It was a secret she could not share, but holding it in his presence felt like an offering of her own broken history. The storm passed, but it left a change in its wake. The silence between them was no longer one of wary distance, but of shared understanding. However, the world outside the ranch had not forgotten them. A week later, 2 riders appeared on the horizon. One was Jedediah Thorne. The other wore the badge of a territorial marshal. Silas met them on the porch, his stance calm but rigid. Mai watched from the kitchen window, her heart pounding. "Blackwood," the marshal said, his voice carrying on the still air. He was an older, impartial-looking man. "Mr. Thorne here has filed a formal complaint. Claims your fence line is encroaching on his property by the South Creek." Thorne smirked, a look of triumph on his face. "That creek is my only water source on that end of my property," he declared. "Your fence is diverting it. That's illegal." "My fence is where it's always been," Silas said, his voice level. "It follows the line on my deed." "Deeds can be wrong. Surveyors make mistakes," Thorne countered smoothly. "The law is based on access to water." The marshal agrees, the fence has to be moved. The marshal sighed. "The complaint is valid on its face, Silas. You've got 30 days to move the fence back 10 yards, or we settle it in a territorial court in Carson City." Mai knew what that meant. A court battle would cost money Silas didn't have and time he couldn't spare. Moving the fence meant losing access to the only reliable water for his small herd during the dry season. It would ruin him. Thorne had found a way to bleed him dry, a death by 1,000 legal cuts. Silas stood silent for a long moment, his jaw tight. He could give in, save himself the fight, and watch his ranch wither and die. Or he could stand his ground and be crushed by the weight of Thorne's money and influence. He made his choice. "I'll see you in court," he said to the marshal. The marshal nodded grimly, as if he'd expected it. As he and Thorne turned to leave, Thorne paused and looked directly at the house, his eyes finding Mai in the window. "Some things," he said, his voice loud enough for her to hear, "aren't worth the trouble they bring." The threat was unmistakable. This was no longer just about a fence line. It was about her. She was the trouble he had brought to Silas Blackwood's door. For months later, the punishing heat of summer had given way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The cottonwoods along the creek bed were turning a brilliant yellow, and the air held the sharp, clean scent of the coming cold. The change in the season was mirrored by a change at the ranch. The oppressive weight of Thorne's threat had been lifted, not by surrender, but by a quiet, stubborn fight. The threat of the territorial court had hung over them for weeks. Silas had grown more withdrawn, spending his evenings staring at his copy of the Homestead Act deed, its legal language a dense, impenetrable thicket. He was a man of horses and land, not of words on a page. He was preparing to lose. It was Mai who had changed everything. One evening, she had found him hunched over the document at the kitchen table, his face etched with frustration. "Let me see," she had said softly. He had looked up, surprised, but pushed the paper toward her. Her father, a merchant in a distant port city, had believed a girl's mind was as important as a boy's. He had insisted she learn not just to speak English, but to read and write it with perfect clarity. Her slender finger traced the flowing script of the territorial surveyor. For 2 nights she studied it, cross-referencing it with Silas's father's old journals, which she found in a dusty trunk. And then she found it. A small, almost insignificant note in the margin of the survey map. The boundary marker was not the creek itself, which the journal confirmed was prone to shifting its course after the spring floods, but a triad of elder cottonwoods on the western bank. Together, they had ridden out to the fence line. The triad of ancient trees stood a good 20 yards inside Silas's fence. The creek had indeed shifted over the years, moving onto Thorne's property, but the legal boundary, the one marked by the unmoving trees, was clear. Silas had telegraphed the Territorial Land Office in Carson City, a costly but necessary expense. Their reply came 3 weeks later, confirming Mai's discovery. The original survey map, stored in their archives, was unambiguous. When the marshal returned, it was with a copy of the official findings. Jedediah Thorne was not only wrong, he was ordered to pay all of Silas's legal and telegraph fees for filing a frivolous claim. The public humiliation was more devastating than any financial penalty. Within a month, A for sale sign was posted on Thorne's property. He sold his land to a family from back east and left the territory, his power in Clayton broken by a quiet rancher and the woman he had dismissed as worthless. With the legal battle won, a new energy settled over the ranch. Mai had expanded her small garden, and the shelves in the root cellar were now lined with jars of preserved vegetables, a colorful bulwark against the coming winter. The house, once a silent shell, now felt like a home, filled with the smells of baking bread and the soft sounds of two people moving in a comfortable, shared space. Silas had taught her how to care for the horses, and she discovered a quiet confidence in their presence. They were partners, their days woven together in a tapestry of shared work and mutual reliance. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, Silas found her leaning against the top rail of the corral, watching the horses. He came to stand beside her, the comfortable silence stretching between them. The fear that had once defined her existence felt like a distant memory, a story that had happened to someone else. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was not a worn letter or a legal summons, but a crisp, new document from the territorial office. He unfolded it and held it out for her to see. It was a land deed. At the top, in clear, official script, were two names, Silas Blackwood and Mai Blackwood. Mai stared at the paper, her breath catching in her throat. He had gone to Clayton, to the same office that had recorded Thorne's complaint, and had legally made her not just his wife, but a co-owner of the homestead. It was a shield, a fortress, a declaration to the world that she belonged. "Don't run from me," he said, his voice soft, almost lost in the vastness of the twilight. He wasn't asking a question or giving a command. It was the same gentle plea he'd made on the road all those months ago. And the lonely Chinese woman finally stayed. She looked from the deed, a promise of a future on paper, to his weathered face, a promise of a future in his eyes. He held out his hand, not to help her onto a wagon, but to join his life with hers. She placed her hand in his. It fit perfectly. Their life together would not be one of grand passions or loud declarations. It would be built of quieter things, shared sunrises, the strength of a solid fence post, and the steady, unspoken knowledge that they were no longer alone. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.